airplanes, they have this figured out, right? One time I read that they actually weigh the magazines that they put in the back seat or the backs of everybody's seats to make sure that they're not weighing down the plane too much for it to have fuel efficiency and for it to get to where it's going to be able to calculate how much fuel is in there. And that's why you see these crazy people at the bag check where they got their bags all open on the floor and they're frantically trying to change things over. That's my job. My wife, she'll pack. We'll measure our bags before we leave, okay? 50 pounds. I know that it was 50 pounds before we left. And then she sneaks something else in there. And then when we get to the airport, we got to unpack everything, and I got to sneak some stuff into a corner somewhere. And they realize that if the plane has too much weight on it, it's not going to make it to its final destination. And they say, look, we have to make sure that we steward what we put on this plane because we want to make it to I wanted to make it to the final destination. I don't know about you this morning, but I would really like to land and not run out of gas before we get there. So they got it figured out. People are ripping stuff out of their suitcases, and Jesus is asking you to rip that stuff, that shame, that loneliness, that depression, that anxiety. He's asking you to rip that stuff out of your life so that you can travel light and run this race with endurance and to the end. And I can't imagine that day when we get to heaven and God says, "Well done, good and faithful servant." You might have fallen. You might have laid on the ground for a while. You might have been taken out by the enemy, but you got back up and you ran the race with endurance. Good job. I can't wait for that day. In the Bible, it says that his yoke, Jesus' yoke, God's yoke is light. His yoke is not a burden. It is light. I'll tell you this story. When I was 6 years old, I think this is the first time that I remember feeling shame in my life. My dad's a real hands-on kind of a guy, and we went to the hardware store for something. I don't remember what it was, and so I'm just tooling around behind the cart, and he gets to the checkout line, and he's got the cart in front of me, and I'm just looking at the candy on the rack and stuff, and I look down on the floor, and there's a bolt and two nuts on the floor, little bitty things, right? And so I pick this bolt and these two nuts up, and I'm kind of just twirling them on, just playing with it. And my dad says, "Okay, Jason, come on." And so I grab that and I walk out. And we get in the car. My dad packs the stuff in the car. He puts my seatbelt on, and he comes around to the back or the other side of the car, and he gets in the driver's seat, and he sees me playing with this nut and bolt. And he's like, "Where did you get that?" And I said, "I got it from the store." See, I had no concept that you needed to pay for things before you left the store. And my dad freaked out. I mean, freaked out. I guess we were a little bit on our ways home because he turned the car around. We drove back to the hardware store. He went in and found a manager. You're going to think my dad's a crazy person, and he kind of is. But he found a manager, and he said, "You guys have a jail here for people that steal, don't you?" And I'm like, "Oh my gosh, I'm going to jail today." And I felt so much shame because I had stolen something. I didn't even know, but I had so much shame. My dad was so disappointed in me. And I was like, "Oh my gosh, I'm 6 years old. How am I gonna go to jail, And I could see the guy's face. He probably thought my dad was crazy too. He kind of had like a half smile on his face, like, "What in the world?" And he's like, "No, you're gonna go to jail today." And I'm like, "Okay, that's interesting." And he was like, "I'll let you go this time, but if this happens again," do you know I've never stole one thing in my life because I was so traumatized by that moment? But that was the first time that I felt shame. We can feel shame in so many different ways, can't we? We can. Here's a couple of examples. A failed relationship, whether you're married or not married, a failed relationship can be shameful sometimes. Our appearance, we may be ashamed of our appearance. How much money we make or don't make. Maybe something that has been said to you or done to you that has created shame in your life. Maybe it's the house that we live in. You don't want to invite anybody over to your house because you don't want them to see what kind of house you live in. Or maybe you could be a Cubs fan. Or even worse, a Cowboys fan. You could have a lot of shame in your life if you don't root for the Chiefs every Sunday and Thursday and Monday night, all right? I had to put that in there for you, Pastor Chris. Am I too far north to make the Cubs joke? Am I going to get flogged after the service this morning? So this begs the question, right? This begs the question, where did shame come from? When did it make its first debut onto the scene? In Genesis, it says this, and the man and his wife, Genesis 2:25, the man and his wife were both naked and they were not ashamed. So there was a point when there wasn't any shame, but when did it come onto the scene? So here we are, 2 chapters into creation. Everything is going great. Adam is naming animals, and he's eating fruit, and he walks with God in the morning. God puts Adam to sleep. He takes out a rib, and when he wakes up, whoa, man, there's a woman standing there. Okay? And Adam is like, this deal's pretty good, right? And he's like, thank you, God. Things are good. And just 1 chapter later, just one, not even really 1 chapter later, Genesis 3:8-10, it says, and they heard the sound of the Lord walking in the garden in the cool of the day. I mean, come on, just put yourself in that moment for a second. You have communed with the God of the universe every morning. You have gotten to speak with him and tell him all the things, and he's telling you how amazing you are and what a great creation you are. And he says, look at all the things that we've created together. Look at all this stuff. And God comes that next morning, and he's looking around. He's like, Adam, Eve, where are you guys? And the man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord God among the trees of the garden. But the Lord called to the man and said to him, where are you? And he said, I heard the sound of you. Can you imagine that you can just hear the sound of God in the garden? You've been with him for that long that you can just hear the sound of him in the garden. I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked and I hid myself. In the next verse, I didn't put this in there, but God almost just in tears, I can see I don't know that God cries, but in tears he says, who told you you were naked? Who told you that you weren't good enough? Who told you that your appearance, you should be ashamed of that? Who told you that I didn't love you? Who told you that you were naked? I can just hear God's heart breaking in that moment. They felt shame for the very first time, and I can't imagine what it would be like for God, but what would it be like for Adam and Eve to have completely changed? They have never felt these feelings before. And now they feel like they need to be removed from their Creator, the one that has walked with them. Who told you you were naked, God asks. Have you ever had a dream that you're running around in your dream naked? Everybody has, so don't act like you haven't, all right? It's a worry, it's a fear that, none of us would get up in the morning and forget to get dressed unless there was something wrong with us, but you have these fears of you running around. For me, it's in my high school. I'm running around naked in my high school, and everybody's like, oh my gosh, it's a fear. It's because we are ashamed of that sometimes. But shame causes us to see ourselves in a negative light, which studies have actually shown leads directly to anxiety and depression disorders. Shame causes us to look at ourselves and say, I'm not good enough, I'm not pretty enough, I'm not handsome enough, I'm not smart enough. And it leads us directly to anxiety and depression disorders. Shame will keep you pinned down for so long that you ultimately never accomplish the purpose that God has for you. And that is exactly what the enemy wants. He wants to keep you down with that weapon of shame, because I love what Pastor Chris said today in his office before we started. He said, shame is a positive motivator if you can get rid of it, right? Because shame is something that we have to feel because of the fall of man, because we sinned. We sin every day. And so shame is something that we always have to feel, but it's that point where you go, okay, I have felt the shame, and I'm either going to step this way and go, okay, God has forgiven me, I'm going to move forward and learn from that. Or you come back to this spot and you say, you know what? I'm not going to do this God thing anymore. I'm going to step in this direction and say, I'm not going back to that church. Pastor Chris doesn't like me. He doesn't care for me. No one has ever said anything about me or whatever. And you choose to start being pinned down by the enemy. He starts to put his foot on your neck and pin you down, because he does not want you to fulfill the purpose that God has for you. He has a foot on your neck, and he knows how crippling it is, and so sometimes that is his first defense, is to get you shameful, to get you full of shame in your life. So let's take a couple of looks at a couple of stories in the Bible that deal with shame, and I want you to see the reaction that Jesus has to these. The first one is the Samaritan woman. I'm not going to read everything here because it's kind of long, and we're just going to go through it right here, but it says that Jesus had left Judea, and you can follow along on the screen if you want, but I'm going to paraphrase, and passing through Samaria, because he had learned that people were starting to talk about how many people he was baptizing. It really wasn't Jesus that was baptizing, it was John, but the Pharisees were upset with him. And so he left Judea, and he was on his way to Galilee, and he stopped in Samaria on the way. And when he did, he stopped at a place where Jacob's well was, and there was a woman sitting there. Now, this was different because there was a couple of things going on here. It says in the Bible that he got there at the 6th hour, which was about 12 o'clock or 1 o'clock in the afternoon, right? And why that's a weird thing is because it's really, really hot. It's the hottest part of the day, and a woman would not go up and get water at the hottest part of the day. She would go at the very earliest point in the day, in the cool of the day, so that it wasn't so hot. And so Jesus gets to this well, and this woman is there, which is the number one red flag. Jesus sits down at the well and starts talking to this woman. And the thing is that he wasn't supposed to talk to her. They didn't talk to each other. It says right here that the disciples had gone on to the city to buy some food, and the Jews had no dealings with the Samaritan woman. And so she was kind of freaked out about this. She's like, "Why are you talking to me?" And he asked her for a drink. And he said, "Listen," or she told him, you don't have anything. This is a deep well. You don't have anything to get a drink with." And he goes, "Look, if you knew who was sitting right here, if you knew who was sitting before you today, you would not have asked for a drink of water. You would have asked for a drink of water that you'd never be thirsty again." And he says, Jesus answered her, "If you knew of the gift of God who was sitting and saying this to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked." So she asked him in John 4:15 through 18, the woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water so that I never thirst again or have to come to draw water." She was trying to look for a way out of coming to the well. She didn't know what he was talking about. Jesus said to her, "Go, call your husband and come here." The woman answered him, "I have no husband." Jesus said to her, "You're right in saying that you have no husband, for you have had 5, and the one that you're with right now is not your husband. What you have said is true." See, the reason that she didn't come in the morning is because she was ashamed that she had had 5 husbands, and the one she was with wasn't her husband either. And it isn't, you look at this story and you would think that she would be upset with Jesus, that she would just throw some water on him and run away. But Jesus has an ability to speak truth in love to us and say, "Look, this isn't the way that you should be living." And just a few moments later in Scripture, she runs back to the town with Jesus and says, "Meet the man who told me things that I never knew." I mean, come on. Jesus speaks truth into her life. He gets rid of the shame, and then she goes and tells everybody about who he is. Don't you feel like that would be a better reaction than laying down and letting the enemy just trample all over us with shame in our life? Wouldn't it be this thing where God says, "You know what? You messed up here, right? But I have nothing but love for you. So let's move on. Let's learn from our mistakes, and let's move on." The second one is Peter's denial. And I really want you to get into the moment. Movies have tried to do it, but I wish that we could be in the moment, in the culture, to understand everything that was going on here. Because we can look on the outside and we can say, how in the world did Peter, just a few nights ago, say, "Lord, it will never be me that tells everybody that I never knew you. It'll never be me that betrays you. Even if all of these people fail, I will not." That's what he said. And then just a few nights later, Peter finds himself at a fire with a little girl and a few other people around. And the little girl goes, "Don't I know you? Weren't you with Jesus?" Peter goes, "No, I never saw him. I never knew him. And about an hour later, someone else says, no, 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 no. I've been thinking about this. I did see you with him. I remember when he healed that little girl. You were right there with him. I remember that. You were standing there right next to him. You must have known him. And Peter says, no, I didn't know him. I promise you I didn't. And about another hour later, another man comes up and he goes, no, you did know him. And Peter curses. He says, no, I didn't. And while he's still talking, what Jesus prophesied, that the rooster would crow, the rooster crowed right there in that moment. And I want you to put yourself in Peter's shoes this morning. Can you imagine? For the last 3 years, you've quit your job. You have followed this man. You have seen people be brought back from the dead. You have seen people, you've had your own ear put back on. Okay? You've seen people be healed in numerous ways, blind people seeing. You've seen 5,000 plus people be fed with a couple of fish and some loaves of bread. You've seen all of these things, and you told him you wouldn't forsake him, that you wouldn't abandon him. And within a couple of hours, you have. I just want you to understand the weight of that situation. How Peter must have felt. One of his best friends has just passed away, died a gruesome death on the cross, and now he's just betrayed him. He's denied him 3 times. But I want you to look at the redemption story here. I want you to see this. In John 21, 4 through 12, it says, just as day was breaking, Jesus stood on the shore. What you need to know is that as soon as he did that, Peter got with some of the disciples and he's like, well, because here's the thing is that they thought that Jesus was coming to eradicate everything and that he would be the ruler. And they were even talking about who was going to sit at the right hand, not in heaven, but here on earth. They were talking about who was going to sit at the right hand of Jesus, who was going to be his number one guy. They thought that he came to earth to establish a kingdom that would eradicate everything else. But that wasn't what he was talking about. And so you can imagine that when all of this happens, when he dies on the cross like a thief, they said, we must have been wrong. Negating all of the things that they've seen him do. Forgetting about all of the stuff that he said. Forgetting about hanging on every single word that he said because he spoke with such authority and power. They forgot about all of that stuff in that moment, and they said, well, I guess we'll go back to doing what we were doing before. We'll get in the boat. We'll go out and catch some fish. So that's where they're at right now. Just as day was breaking, Jesus stood on the shore. Yet the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to them, children, do you have any fish? They answered him, no. He said to them, cast your nets on the other side of the boat. You remember when Jesus said that once before? He said, cast your nets on the other side of the boat, and you will find some. So they cast it, and now they were not able to haul it because there were so many fish in the net. The disciples whom Jesus loved, therefore, said to Peter, it is the Lord. Can you imagine having been Peter in that moment, casting those nets, oblivious to who's on the shore, in that moment, casting the net on the other side and thinking, this is a deja vu kind of a moment here. Because when he first met Jesus, he was in a boat just like that. And Jesus said, hey, have you caught any fish? They said, no. He said, cast your nets on the other side. And can you imagine in that moment, Peter's down on the boat bed, and he's pulling up, and as he feels the weight of the fish. And I have to think that in his mind he's going, that's Jesus. And although he may be joyful that it's Jesus and have lots of questions, in that moment he realizes that he's going to have to face the shameful thing that he did. So they pull the nets up onto the boat. And this disciple says to the rest of them, it is the Lord. Peter jumps off of the boat. He was about 100 yards from shore. Peter jumps off of the boat into the water and swims as hard as he can. You know why? I feel like this is not theology. And I got this from my father-in-law. You know why? I think he wanted to get to Jesus first. I think he felt so much shame. I think he felt so badly that he wanted to get to Jesus first, because if he was going to get scolded, he wanted it to be alone, not with all of his disciples around him. Because we don't know whether they know that he did deny knowing Jesus. He gets to the shore, and through the fog, he starts to walk up the beach, and he starts to see a fire and fish sizzling on the fire. And Jesus looks up. I can see his face. Jesus looks up at Peter and says, Peter, I love you. Now let's eat. Can you imagine that moment? All that Peter wanted to say, Jesus, I'm so sorry. I know that I said I wouldn't. I know that I said, and Jesus doesn't even let him speak. He just says, Peter, I love you. Now let's eat some fish. It says that they got to land. The rest of them, they pulled fish up onto the shore in the nets. They could barely get it up there. And they start to eat breakfast together. And I looked up, and these aren't the number 1 and 2, but I looked up to see what are the most powerful words and the most wanted words to be heard from someone. And one of them is, I love you. The second one is, I forgive you. And the third one is, let's eat. I'm serious. Let's eat. Jesus could have ripped him apart. He could have said, no, you get back in the boat. I don't want to see your face. I'm not here for you. And maybe you feel that way today. Maybe you feel like you've done so many things that you said you wouldn't do. You promised you wouldn't do them, and you still did. Maybe you still are. And Jesus is looking at you this morning saying, I love you, and I forgive you. It's amazing. Jesus prepared a table in the midst of a defeated enemy. He had just won the keys to hell and the grave. He prepared a meal in front of his enemies, in front of his shame, in front of his disappointment. And he said, come on, let's eat. Now, I struggled with this when I was a kid. When I was a teenager in my 20s, I struggled because I didn't understand how God could be so loving that he could just forget about what I did. And I still struggle with that. When I said I wouldn't do something, when I promised, Lord, this is the last time, I'll never say that again, and then in the moment I know what I'm doing and feel the conviction of the Lord afterwards and say, our thought goes to, God must not want to be with me anymore because he's mad at me. And that's not the truth. You see, we can't comprehend it because God is bigger than us. We can't comprehend that kind of love because he is love. In the normal world, we would go, look, you've done this to me so many times, I have to create a boundary to keep you out of my life. That is not what Jesus does. He prepares a table. My last point this morning, if the worship team wants to come. He prepares a table right in the midst of his shame and his embarrassment. In Peter's darkest hour, Jesus looks at him and smiles and says, I love you, Peter. Now let's eat. In Psalm 23, David wrote the same thing. Listen to this morning. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. Now, I like to eat, okay? I do. That's my favorite thing to do. Ask Pastor Chris. Almost every day, about 11 o'clock, I'd be starting to make plans to go out and eat. I'd be like, hey, Chris, you want to go out to eat today? And he would always say no. And then I'd finally had enough money, 2 pennies to rub together. And I said, listen, if you go to dinner with me, I'll pay for it. He's like, okay, let's do it, And so I love to eat. And so I always thought of this as he prepares this, like on movies where they have the really long table, you know what I mean? And they've got a feast put on it, right? That's what I thought, because I was like, I'm going to belly up to that dude. I'm going to have a chicken wing in this hand and, a piece of corn in the other hand, and we're going to have a feast in the middle of our circumstances, in the middle of the enemy being right there. But I want you to see it this way. I'd never seen it this way before. A shepherd with sheep, after they had come out of the valley and come up onto a high part where there was flat ground, that's where they would sleep at night. And so the shepherd would put the sheep in a place where he knew that they were safe, and then he would go around to the rest of they call it a table. That's where they get prepared the table. He would go around to all the little holes. There was these little snakes called adder snakes that would come up out of the ground and nip the sheep on the face, and they could get infected and die. And so what he would do is he would take oil and he would pour it around the hole and inside the hole to make it slippery, and they didn't like the smell of the oil. And he would go around and make sure that there was no coyotes or wolves or bears or anything like that. He would prepare the table. And that's what Jesus does for every single one of us today. He not only will take the shame away from you and create a whole new story for you, he wants the shame to never even get to you. But you have to stay in the safety of the shepherd. What happens is that we feel like we've got it all figured out, and we start to walk away from the care of the shepherd. In Psalm 23, it says before that he causes me to lie down in green pastures. That means that we feel so safe with Jesus that he lays us down. Doesn't that just, by streams of living water. Doesn't that sound like you're traveling pretty light? That you just get to lay down in a green pasture and let Jesus take care of the snakes and the temptations around you and the enemy that's prowling around like a lion? You get to lie down and rest, instead of always being in turmoil as to why this suitcase of life for me is so heavy. You see, in a moment, Peter, with all that shame and all that heaviness that he felt, in a moment in God's presence, he felt like he was welcomed back in again. And Jesus can do that for you today, too.
Hey there, just wanted to take a minute to say thanks for watching. If a friend sent you this link, it's because they believe what we talked about today is going to make a positive impact in your life. And if it did, there's probably somebody that you care about who could benefit from it. So take a minute to share this video with somebody. Post it to your timeline or send them a direct link. And if you're able, take a minute to give using the link at the bottom of the description on this video. One last thing. Maybe you feel a tug at your soul and you're ready to take the next step in your spiritual life and form a relationship with God. We've got folks here who would love to talk with you about it. So just text prayer to the number on your screen and we'll follow up with you. It's also in the description on this video in case that helps. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.